But this is, as you can see from the graphic of green, if you're able to come in via laptop mobile, credible transition in the steel industry, the launch of the climate bond standard for steel, at least the consultation phase. We'll hear more about that detail in a minute from Fabiana Contreras of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We are now live on YouTube. People can watch this on YouTube, but more importantly for everyone listening, you'll be able to see a recording of this event on YouTube should you decide that it's useful for colleagues to have a listen in. Hopefully you'll find the session of interest in the meantime. We're going to get going. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. We're an NGO, a global NGO dedicated to climate action. Leave the screen up for a little bit more if you can, Louisa, just while while I make my initial comments. We're lucky enough to have a star panel with us. You can see from the photos, from their great portrait photos, where they come from. I'm going to introduce in a minute Fabiana Contreras, who's the Industry Transition Analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative, who is going to do a presentation. But we also have Haleh Hassanbegui, who's the founder and CEO of Global Efficiency Intelligence and been the technical consultant working with Fabiana on these criteria and supporting the technical expert group that we've had. The technical expert group is made up of... Sorry, I'm having problems with my connections, everyone.
Sean, maybe you want to stop your video. Maybe that will help for now.
Seems a good connection. Fabiana, am I breaking up to you?
Right now, no, but at the beginning, yes.
Okay. Fabiana, I will ask you to signal off your hand if I'm breaking up again, and I will try different alternatives. Oh, I am breaking up. Damn. Okay, folks, my sincere apologies. This is very unusual. My connection seems to be failing me, so I'm going on audio to improve the quality of the content. I'll see if it improves in a few minutes. We have with us also Max Ammann, who's the Associate Professor and Head of Division at the Environmental Energy Systems Studies at Lund University and a key member of the Technical Working Group. Eric van Dossum, who's the Director and Steel Lead in Metals, Mining and Fertilizers at the EMEA Division of ING, the major Netherlands-based bank. And then Anna Creed, who's the Head of Standards, or has been Head of Standards and is currently the Head of Thought Leadership, in fact, at Climate Bonds Initiative, who will weigh in. This is going to be a panel introducing the steel criteria the Climate Bonds is proposing to adopt for the Climate Bond Standard and the certification scheme, which would allow the certification of fixed income instruments and debt of all kinds, in fact, under the Climate Bond scheme. That will mean bonds, it'll mean loans, it'll mean short-term paper by the time we're finished. But of course, there's a background to this. You all know what the challenges are. We have I'm going to call it an existential challenge that we face with climate change in addressing the need to reduce our emissions by 50%, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by 2030, in a bit over 7 years, if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change on the planet. That's what we're looking at the moment. That requires some fairly drastic and difficult changes in terms of how we run our societies, our economies, and our industries. That it requires transitions. We need to transition the chemical industry, the cement industry, the aluminium industry, the mining industry from higher carbon practices to low carbon or zero carbon practices. And we need to do that in the steel industries. There will be some industries that will disappear. in this transition. Industries that are based on fossil fuels and don't have another choice, there are some, will find it very difficult to find a place in the world we are building in the future. There is a transition period for that, of course. But industries like steel, very hard to do without steel in the world we live in. We're in the middle of the beginning of a huge capital investment boom in infrastructure and urban development in emerging markets, a bit like what China has seen over the last 30 years. Demand for steel, if anything, is going to go up in the next 30 years. So we've really got to ensure that while we continue to use steel, it doesn't contribute to the very problem that's creating this dire emergency, the climate emergency we currently face. That means zero carbon steel. That's where we have to get to. What we're proposing today is a set of measures towards that end. I'll let our speakers talk a little bit more about it, but do note that we have an emergency. It will require a lot of capital. We understand the capital expenditure requirements, investment requirements in steel transition. We appreciate they're very large. We are lucky. We are lucky because we have the capital available on the planet now, more capital available now than ever before in the history of humanity. And we've proven with the growth of the green bonds market globally, currently sitting at $1.8 trillion or thereabouts outstanding, that capital is interested in green. We know the money will flow. Green bonds are frequently, nearly universally, more oversubscribed than ordinary bonds. They get a variety of other benefits. We can go to that another webinar. The point is it exists. It's the fastest growing asset class on the planet. We want to ensure that steel is part of that asset class with the right kinds of investments. However, this is a consultation phase. You will have the next couple of months to respond. We are keen, we are excited by the prospect of getting critical feedback to the criteria we published so that we can improve before we finalise towards the end of summer. Please do treat this as a draft for feedback. This is not a final criteria at this stage, although hopefully, of course, we've done reasonably well at preparing criteria that can withstand comment and review. On that note, I'd like to introduce Fabiana Contreras, who will run us through the proposal that we're making today.
Thank you, Sean. We're going to start with Anna Creed. She's going to explain a bit about really what the criteria will cover and some of the plans that the climate bond standard has for expansion. So I'm going to give it first to Anna.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. Very nice to be here today. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you as a bit of an introduction, a very brief introduction about the transition program at CBI. So as Sean has said, we're in a really critical period, as we all know, with the challenge to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050, which is obviously a very fundamental, very rapid, very substantial decarbonisation transition. And so our program within CBI, the transition program, is really critical to a lot of the work that we're doing as we seek to continue our mission to mobilise the finance needed to address these climate challenges. Within that, we're really working to influence the policymakers, to support them to do their own efforts towards transition and incentivise and enable the financial markets and other actors. We're also looking to provide the data and reports and the tools to assess and track transition credentials and the impact of related financial instruments. And we're engaging with our investor partners in their efforts in this space as well, that are leading the way in mobilising the transition. Underpinning all of this is the really clear need for clear science-based targets and criteria for transition. As ever at CBI, we are dedicated really to avoiding greenwashing in transition, as much as we've been dedicated to avoiding it in the use of proceeds markets as well. So to this end, we're really looking to expand our suite of criteria under the standard, and that also then flows into our policy advice, into our market tracking and tools and data and reports, into our partner engagement, etc. But that expansion is effectively trying to move us into a wider array of sectors. I think we've always said at CBI that reducing emissions is a whole economy objective. It really means addressing emissions in all sectors. We have previously focused on the energy sector, particularly renewable energy. We've got criteria for forestry and land use, for water infrastructure, waste management, and a number of other sectors. But now we're really moving at scale into heavy industry and harder to abate sectors. So we're obviously going to talk to you about the steel criteria today. We've got criteria in the latter stages of development also for chemical production and for cement production. We're working on hydrogen at the moment as well, and then we're going to move on to oil and gas and other sectors after that. So we're really moving into these new sectors that we have not got much criteria for at the moment. As well as that, though, as well as that kind of breadth of expansion, we're also going for depth, because we've obviously all seen in the financial markets, yes, there are transition-related use of proceeds bonds, which are fantastic, and we want to see those grow, but we've also seen the very rapid growth in SLBs, which are being used to finance or being linked to transition-related KPIs. And we also obviously are very aware of all the net zero targets and initiatives going on in the corporate sector and in the relating to investor portfolios. So we also want to be able to serve that segment of the market as well and be able to evaluate the credibility of transition and all those other instruments. So we're looking to shortly be able to certify SLBs, companies, associated debt, directory investments, and all of those own instruments. All of that kind of expansion in terms of what I might say is that the depth of the criteria, the number of types of things we'll be able to certify. It means that in all of our criteria, as you'll see in the steel today, but in all of our criteria going forward, we're really looking to develop multiple interlinked layers of criteria. We want to be able to assess, and we want others in the market to be able to assess capital investments driving transition. Sometimes we call those internally at CBI the measures. We want to be able to assess the economic activities that these sectors really are representing. We want to be able to assess the key assets that drive those activities. And overall, like I say, want to be able to assess the company level transitions of these kind of organizations in these sectors. So we've got multiple layers of interlinked criteria as well. So there's quite a lot of work going on within CBI around transition. It's big, it affects our criteria, but off the back of that, it affects all of our work in policy, markets, engagement, etc. So that's just a brief introduction to give you a bit of context that the steel criteria is sitting within. So Fabi, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to share my presentation in a second. All right. So I'm going to present the criteria. I'm going to start showing you our technical working group. We're very thankful for this group of people. We have basically the criteria is based on the discussions we have had with them for the last 7 months. It's a very diverse group of people. As you can see, we have members from different types of organizations that are also in parallel working for steel decarbonization initiatives, like, for example, the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Science Based Target Transitions Pathway Initiative, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. But we also have a lot of researchers, people working in energy modeling for different regions around the world. Also in transition pathways like Xiaoyu from the Pacific Northwest Laboratory, and professors like Max Amann, who is going to be in our panel at the end. During this process, I provided the coordination and also writing the final documentation. And Ali Hassan Beji, who is also going to be at the end in our panel, he provided the technical consultation for also our documents, and is somebody who also has published a lot of research on steel decarbonization. So we also, in parallel, had an industry working group, and this has representatives from the financial sector, like Eric, who will be at the end from ING, and from verifiers, but also from industry. So in this sense, we're thankful for the World Steel Association, who helped us have that connection with industry and bring over people from ArcelorMittal, Bao Steel, Ternium from Brazil, the Latin American Association of Steel, and other companies from the sector. It's important to note that the industry working group gives us feedback on the usability, applicability, ambition of our criteria, but at the end, we take this feedback very serious, but the technical working group has the last word of what is in the criteria. All right, so it is good to understand what is behind the criteria, and this has also helped us see what is the scope. In this graph, you have in the left the blast furnace. This is the traditional way of producing steel. it is recognized as the way to reuse primary inputs, meaning iron ore, to produce steel. It represents 70%, more than 70% of the global production of steel. It is highly emitting, as you can see at the bottom. It can emit up to 2.9 tons of CO2 per ton of steel because it's highly reliant on coal. So in order to reduce the iron ore, you need to use coal. It also fuels the process, so it's a lot of energy that has a lot of emissions. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is also important to consider because it represents how we make steel mostly at the moment. And it's also good to notice that it can use up to 30% of scrap in the blast oxygen furnace, but still that doesn't lower emissions at levels we want to see in the future. On the right, you have the two ways we can use an electric arc furnace to produce steel. You can use from 0 to 100% of scrap, which is recycled steel, which is secondary inputs, in the electric arc furnace for the production of steel. But the amount you use will depend on the availability of the scrap and also on the quality of the steel you want to produce. So this is also a technological barrier, let's say. If you need to combine the scrap with iron, the iron will come from a direct reduced iron facility. This is currently reliant on natural gas, but in the future, we can switch this to green hydrogen, or at the moment, actually, we should start switching this to green hydrogen to lower the emissions. So basically, the electric arc furnace routes can become very low in emissions if we use low carbon energy to power the EAF, if we use green hydrogen for the reduction process in the DRI, and also the more scrap we use. Okay, so that's what I want you to take from this slide. The difference between the two types of ways to make steel in the emissions, which you can see at the bottom, that on the right side has way lower emissions. And also that there are different inputs of scrap and secondary and primary inputs to each of the processes. So maybe this makes you think that we should move all steel to be produced with the electric arc furnace and 100% scrap. But what the science tells us and the models tells us is there is a limit to that. And we need to consider on how we use steel. This graph, the purple part, tells us that 52% of steel is used for stuff that has a long service life. This means that it takes a long time because steel is very durable. It takes a long time for secondary steel to become available. As Sean mentioned, demand for steel will increase alongside populations, emerging market standards of living. So we are going to need more steel to come into the market. Most models tell us that there are limits to the quantity and quality of available scrap, and that will become available in the future. So what we should take from this is that steel production in the future will require a massive increase in recycled steel available, but we still will continue to use iron ore. What we have done in this criteria is that we have included criteria, very strict criteria for the different ways of producing steel and to make them low carbon, how to test if they are low carbon. It's also good to mention here that we are basing most of our criteria in the model from the IEA Net Zero by 2050. And in this one, it estimates that in the future, in 2050, secondary steel will represent 46% of steel production. So that tells you kind of an estimate of what we can expect. Right. So this is the pathway we have chosen to inform all of our criteria. So everything we have written is based on what these targets tell us. So here you see that we have intensity levels and when the production of steel should reach those levels, right? We know where we want to be in 2030. This pathway we adopted from the Steel Climate Aligned Finance Steel Working Group. They are being facilitated by the Rocky Mountain Institute. And what they did is that they took this IEA NCE pathway for steel and they split the carbon budget in two, between primary steel or steel produced from primary inputs and steel produced from secondary inputs. In saying this in a simple way, this is a way to compare apples with apples. So it's a bit complex to explain, but it comes also from a recommendation and an agreement in the industry. and in all these initiatives for steel decarbonization. And what it does is, like, if you are a producer and you're mostly based on primary steel production, meaning coming from iron ore, your target should be morely based in the pathway in the top, because your emissions are higher. And also for the other case, when you're mostly a secondary producer, you still have an incentive to lower your emissions, even though those are way lower than those from primary steel. At the end, the producers will calculate a weighted average, so it's something in between these two pathways, but this is a good way to give the proper incentives to producers. All right, so how do we use this? What we want to encourage in this criteria is to do things that we know can be done now to decarbonize steel. So first, we know that before 2030, existing steel facilities can implement energy efficiency measures or switch to alternative fuels in order to lower their emissions. The pathway also tells us that these mitigation measures need to be implemented in groups, not just little measures will not make us reach the levels that we want at 2030. We also have to look at preventing locking in of heavily emitting technologies. So we don't want to see new unabated fossil-based plants. You will see that in the new facilities criteria. And we know that we can start promoting the use of low carbon energy in steel production in the EAF, for example. There is also some measures that we can take now that will be low carbon already. So we'll be at levels beyond 2030, and we also want to encourage that. And these are the three I show here: investing in low emission DRI EAF capacity, emerging technologies like green hydrogen, and increasing the percentage of steel produced by scrap EAF. So this is the background of all the criteria that I'm going to explain now. So what is covered by the criteria? This is similar to the graph that Anna showed before. It has 3 levels. The first level is for the facility. We have split it in new facilities and facilities that are currently on operation. We have also the second level, which is capital investments within facilities producing steel, and then the company level certification. There are 2 components to our criteria. Mitigation is the one I'm going to be focused most this presentation on. And then at the end, I will speak a bit about adaptation and resilience criteria. All the levels need to meet this. So we start with the new steel production facilities. Like I said in the pathway before, eligible assets, we can now, if we're going to build a new facility, this can already be low carbon. So this is the list of eligible facilities in the left. The first 4 are still fossil based. If that is going to happen, then they need to have a carbon capture, and they should capture at least 70% of all emissions. There is also additional criteria to prevent leakages during transportation and storage. For the scrap-based electric arc furnace, we're asking for it either uses 70% of scrap, or this 70% is covered by a combination of scrap or 100% hydrogen-based DRI. Then for hydrogen-based facilities, we are asking that the carbon intensity thresholds for hydrogen are met. These are set in the criteria and will be replaced very soon by our new hydrogen criteria that will become published. And at the end, for electrolysis, because it has a lot of emissions for electricity usage, we ask for a plan to address scope 2 emissions using more low carbon energies. Along the way, you will see that all criteria has additional criteria for hydrogen, biomass, fossil gas, or carbon capture that needs to be met by all these in case they are using any of these facilities. So that was the new 4 facilities that are already in operation. The first 2 are for the blast furnace. So we split the blast furnace in 2. Between the blast furnace that is younger, which means that has been in operation for less than 15 years. And the rationale for this is that those facilities should not go for relining yet. Going for relining means to extend their life. So we're trying to prevent carbon lock-in of these technologies. So we're not certifying investments in relining, but we are telling that you can implement decarbonization measures to decrease your emissions, to lower your emissions to the levels from before 2030. If your emissions are below 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, it should be by 15%. And if they are above, it should be more. It should be by 20% to reach those. And this should be by 2030. Then for the older blast furnaces, for facilities that have been running for longer than 15 years, again, because we want to prevent locking in these technologies, we will allow them to implement we will certify if they implement the decarbonization measures, but they have to significantly decrease their emissions by at least 50%, because this is what will meet the decarbonization pathway before 2030. Then production line with a DRI. If it's fossil, it's very similar, so implementing a bundle of measures. If the facility is fossil gas-based, reductions need to be around 20% or more. And if it's coal-based, it needs to be significant, so more than 40% reduction in emissions. And for electric arc furnace, we asked that they have a plan to address Scope 2 emissions by increasing renewable energy use. So this is existing facilities. Now, for capital investments, which means measures inside a facility, investing in pieces of a facility, we're basically saying that this can only be done if the facility is ambitious enough and meets the criteria that I mentioned in the slide before. So in order to certify these investments, they need to meet the same criteria that I explained for existing facilities. Then we have criteria for companies. Basically, companies need to, this is the same pathway I showed. So the weighted average emissions intensity across all the companies' production facilities need to meet the pathway. Either if you can qualify for tier 1 if you meet the threshold values at the time of certification, and you qualify for tier 2 if you pledge that will meet the threshold values for 2030 by 2030. There is also additional criteria, of course, for both tiers, like having detailed transition plans. All new plants need to meet the criteria that I explained before. You have adaptation and resilience criteria, of course, and also these criteria for cross-cutting the use of specific technologies or feedstocks. So these are the levels of our criteria. We also have cross-cutting mitigation criteria, which is specific for biomass, if you're going to use biomass for hydrogen. And then for carbon capture and storage, it should be preventing there are leakages in the transportation and storage, and also usage is only for long-lasting products. Then for fossil gas, these are eligible only before 2030, and you need to have in place monitoring, reporting, verification, and mitigation measures to prevent methane leakages. So finally, we have the adaptation and resilience criteria, and what this is that issuers are required to carry out an assessment of their system boundaries, the climate risks, and how to mitigate those risks. There is also needs to be in place ongoing monitoring. All the criteria have a disclosure component. We ask for full public disclosure of the required assessment, and this is how we test that the criteria are met. So yeah, as Sean mentioned, this is all to invite you to the public consultation, and everything, all the documents will be published in this website, and we will have a form with questions that you can fill in to help us assess the criteria document that we are discussing today. And we can now go to our panel, and I'm going to invite Sean back in, and of course ask questions.
Thanks, Fabiana. Hopefully the audio holds. Please use your hand again if there's a problem.
All right, it's good.
As you can see, folks, there's a lot in this because it's complicated. You know, there's a mixture of individual investments that are consistent with what we've got to achieve. There's guidance around the emissions trajectory of the sector, and so on. I'm going to turn over and ask Max to start us off on the panel with his thoughts and comments on the challenges and, of course, Max, the opportunities in this transition.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's been a real pleasure to work in this technical working group, first to say. Well, I mean, to start with, I'd just like to reiterate what Sean said perhaps before. The overall guiding aim of this criteria is to meet the 1.5 degree target. And that is in itself extremely ambitious. And that means that I know for a lot of businesses, steel businesses, these targets and the criteria set out here will appear very, very challenging. I have full respect for that. But I mean, we're not nasty. We have just said that this is the reality we live in. This is the reality of the 1.5 degree target. It's just maths. There's no way around it. So you have to excuse us for that. But on the positive note, steel is actually a very nice sector to work in right now if you want to work in transition, because you can actually see the transition happening every day here now. I started to work with steel in 2016, more heavily engaged in the Swedish project that I think a lot of you have heard, Hybrid. They have now competition as well, even in Sweden, other projects as well. And that competition is now spreading. There's Germany, there's China, there's Japan, there's Korea, and I think also India is now also picking up. So, I mean, there's been a radical sea change in attitude and in opportunities for the steel sector for the past 5 years. And that is really encouraging to see. So there is a momentum now. And for the coming 10 years, roughly speaking, give or take 10% on that number now, but around 1,000 megatons of steel capacity will be up for relining of blast furnaces. That around half of the total steel capacity we have. The decisions taken at those sites, the decisions taken the coming 10 years will be crucial if steel is to make its commitment to the 1.5 degree target. I think there's a very good opportunity that steel actually will do this and will help the world go to this target. But it also, in one sense, is also very interesting that steel should and could be also a role model for the other hard-to-abate sectors. We have cement coming up. In my view, maybe biased, they're a little bit behind steel, but they're actually moving quite quickly now. We have aluminium, different challenges. We have petrochemicals, they have a huge challenge, to be honest. But there are actually things are starting to happening now. And if steel can show the way, that there is possibilities even for these sectors to actually take action and make it profitable and make it sustainable, then that would be a huge contribution for of the steel sector to the global climate work. So on that positive note, I would like to sort of just leave it there and hand over to the next one. But again, the next 10 years are crucial for the investment decisions taken. Thank you.
It is a really good point, Max, isn't it? That, you know, steel is what you might call high carbon intensive. There's a hell of a lot of fossil fuels involved in doing it. We need steel. If we can shift steel and shift it quickly, which is, of course, what we need to explore here in terms of timelines and so on, is there anything we can't do? Probably not. So this is a real bellwether industry in this say. Eric, you're the banking sector, you look at the steel sector. What do you see happening with your clients? And I'm also interested to ask what you see happening on the investor side with your colleagues, working investors, in terms of appetite for change, interest in engaging the steel sector on this. What's the landscape look like for you?
Sure, thanks, Sean, and thanks for having me. Well, I say that I would echo what Max is saying, is that when we used to talk about sustainability to steel company CFOs 5 years ago, and in particular around, of course, the energy transition and decarbonization, those were typically difficult conversations. And it was clear that this was something that, you know, they knew they had to do, but they weren't entirely ready to talk about yet. I think that picture has changed completely and very, very rapidly. And now we actually see people reaching out to us instead of us, you know, picking up the phone and, well, nagging about it, if you like, and saying that they have plans to actually do decarbonization investments. If we can help them, if they,
Eric, I've got to interrupt you. Everyone, did you hear that?
Yeah.
This was an ING banker saying he's nagging his clients about sustainability. I'm going to say, Eric, this is a turnaround on the whole banking industry the last 20 years. I appreciate ING as a leader, but that's how change happens. That just want to savor that moment, Eric. This is exciting. Please, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe to linger on that for a second, right? And I guess that also goes for all the investors that you have on the line here. I mean, the world is changing so quickly, and you have an industry here that is going to be impacted so much by the energy transition that you cannot have a strategical conversation with senior management of a company without involving the energy transition. It's simply not possible. And this is actually a great place where you see, and this is of course something that ING has been trying to say already for a long time, but where things like credit risk are completely linked to sustainability. Because if you know that there are going to be carbon prices, if you know that we need to be net zero, and if you're still operating, for instance, a non-mitigated blast furnace in the middle of the 30s, then as an investor, you're going to think like, well, is this company still going to be there in 10 years? Like, how is their performance going to be impacted by that situation? And this changing world and the changing landscape and the changing views of investors as well. So slowly but surely, and actually in the steel industry, it happened very, very quickly. There was a realization that these two are linked, and therefore it comes to the forefront. But we tried to push that already a little bit longer. But we see now that there's a response to that. And I think that's also why initiatives like this are very, very important, because until now it wasn't very, very clear to say, okay, I can do an investment, but can I issue a green bond for it, right? What is considered green is one of the big questions that actually I hear, both from steel companies, from bankers and investors. Those are some of the questions that I think, this initiative and also the sustainable steel principles that we are doing with the Rocky Mountain Institute are trying to answer and trying to create some kind of benchmark and guidelines, because that again helps to evolve the conversation, right? If you have a benchmark, then you can have a better conversation. So there's rapid change, there's rapid realization of the industry that this is very, very important. We are linking these things together. And I think also on the investor side, which is something that, of course, as a bank, I'm slightly less familiar with. But what we hear, for instance, if we're talking to investors about, selling loans, that people are extremely keen to take on anything that is green or linked to decarbonization. And I think the appetite for those kind of investments is huge. And, given that, the financing is available, now we're getting the standards in place. So now, it's up to the government also a little bit to put the right regulatory environment in place so investments can actually be made at ever increasing scale.
Ever increasing scale is actually the name of the game, isn't it? So thank you, and also thank you for that call for clarity, which of course is why you've been involved in this project. I appreciate, but this is one of the things that we've been promoting the Klampons through the certification scheme, through our standards work and our taxonomy work in Europe and Asia and Latin America. Clarity about what to do. Ali, over to you. I mean, clarity about what to do is all very well, but I'm interested to see what you think about achievability. Like, is what we're proposing, which you've been obviously part of, how hard is that? How straightforward is that? What are the factors here? What are the issues in making these transitions from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Sean. It is challenging, but absolutely achievable and possible. I mean, if we want to keep track with 1.5 degree, of course, it's not an easy task. But fortunately, the good news is we are hearing one government after another setting targets, 2050 targets, and now more and more 2030 targets. So from government policy, regulatory, we are getting some support there. And companies are setting targets and taking actions too. But also this whole ecosystem is coming together well. For example, the price of renewable energy is dropping significantly, as everybody knows here. And that helps. That helps with, for example, green hydrogen production. Our own analysis is showing by 2030, green hydrogen is going to be much cheaper than actually blue hydrogen. So, and now Eric mentioned on the side of financing, there is a lot of appetite there. So it's all coming together, and now we just need some leaders, especially in the industry. At the end of the day, it's the steel industry that's going to save itself, not somebody from outside coming. The steel industry has all the expertise, all the smart people, all the smart engineers to develop these technologies, to implement and adopt these new technologies. So it's just a matter of now having some leaders taking right decision and implementing these technological advancements that are pretty commercial now, as we see now with this stuff happening, for example, in Sweden and other parts with some of these new technologies. And another thing that wasn't mentioned, that now with a new wave of, this green steel, low carbon steel demand through green public procurement, green private procurement, now governments are aiming to set criteria for their public procurement requiring greener, low carbon steel. So there's going to be that demand pool. So that will also provide some assurance for these, leaders and pioneers to go and implement some of these technologies that in the beginning might cost a little more. Hopefully the finance side will help, but that, demand pool for this low carbon steel will help as well. So overall, it's promising. It looks like a lot happening in the steel industry, as Max said, compared to some other industries. So it's very exciting. And hopefully they keep the momentum and turn all these words and the excitement into some concrete action. Because as Max said, the next 10 years is really very critical. We can't really overstate the importance of the next 10 years. Once you implement or just you construct a new blast furnace, just as you did before, it's just going to lock in all that capital. And, we are talking about very significant amount of capital. So we want to avoid that. We want to do things differently. I think you're
muted, Sean.
Blast furnaces have a long life, Ali, right? So what is a typical lifespan?
Well, usually can go easily 25 years, but with relining, we have blast furnaces working for 50 years and plus. So yes, it's a significant amount of capital invested. Yeah.
But my understanding is we've got something unusual happening in Europe as distinct from of Asia, which is a lot of blast furnaces coming to the end of their life. Have I got that right?
That is true. In Europe, especially, we are in that unique position. And fortunately, European environment and policy environment is something that, is supportive of this transition. Whereas in China, a lot of blast furnaces, they're younger. Average age of blast furnace in China is 15 years or less. However, China and India together account for 60% of steel production. So anything we are talking about, anything we are going to do, we should have significant consideration of those two countries and make sure they're included and their transition is taken into account. But Europe can lead, and some of these new technologies, once we have 5, 10, 20 plants, implement them, then I guess some of the scariness of these new technologies go away. And that actually can contribute more. And then Chinese and Indians and other steel producer can feel comfortable to adopt those new technologies as well.
So in Europe, we've got a chance to make the right decision as we replace plants subject to the relining question. Your point about India and China, and maybe Max, this is a question for you, will depend on whether we see out the fossil fuel intense systems or whether we can change and reduce the amount of fossil fuel exposure in existing plants while we're doing relining. Is that feasible? Can we do that, or is that just actually really, really hard to reduce the emissions profile of existing plants as we go forward? Max?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I got the last question, but just to pick on what Ali said, I think it's very important to understand that, China do have a large blast furnace fleet, but they have too much of it and they know it. So they're reducing it anyway. They will not build so many new blast furnaces, and they don't need to actually. And the blast furnaces coming up for aligning and in the next 10 years. And of course, you could reline them and go for another 20 years, but you could also then change and shift to something else. Actually, that's a good opportunity. India is in a different position. They're actually expecting to grow their steel production substantially the coming 10 years. And their decisions will also be extremely crucial. What will they invest in, actually? Will they only invest in blast furnaces or in coal gasification with direct reduction, or will they actually make more sustainable investments? So that I think, so different countries are in different positions here. and as you said, I would stick my tongue out and say that in Europe, blast furnaces are slowly withering away, simply because there is very little appetite to reinvest in them due to very tough climate policy, and also a notion that the social license to operate for blast furnaces is running out. The only option is to keep CCS. That has been slow moving in Europe so far. That might be a more easy option in China or India. We don't know yet, but in Europe so far it seems slow, at least.
And it's a relatively expensive solution, right? In the sense that we have to then cover the whole cost of the apparatus of CCS. Possible, but still challenging. We had on a climate bonds webinar a couple of months ago the CEO of Adaptation in India, and I'm interested in your comments about new blast furnaces in India and how we might, from a global perspective, influence those outcomes. This guy, Robbie Singh, the CFO, was arguing that they're going to be producing green hydrogen at 97 cents a kilo by 2026 and $1.50 a kilo by the end of this year. And they're using that initially for green ammonia production to replace fertilizer, because fertilizer costs have gone through the roof in India with the gas prices going up. So they needed a substitution. But they're also delivering that to things like a Gujarat industrial hub where JSW are planning to build a steel plant using hydrogen. Is the price reduction that we're beginning to see in green hydrogen, and I mean, these are claims, we haven't got evidence of this yet, but does that, if he's right about delivering at 97 cents a kilo into an industrial hub where a steel plant is, does that make it a lot easier for you to make this decision, or is it still marginal and a difficult question for a whole lot of issues involved? Give us a sense of how hard this is in India specifically. It's a tough question, Max. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a tough question, but yes, but I like the question because I mean, a lot of producing low-cost green hydrogen can be done with green electricity, but then you need to have the right framework for actually producing the green electricity at the lowest cost possible. And India has huge potential. So does Australia. So does South Africa. Actually Northern Scandinavia, and there are other countries that, at least if you look on a map, like Iran, that probably has huge potential for both solar and wind, but we know there's currently it's not much happening in terms of renewable electricity since they have large so much gas available. So I mean, given the right incentives to produce green electricity, you could produce green hydrogen very, very, very cheaply, and then of course you would change the whole logic. And that is also what's interesting in this steel transition, and also interesting from a investor position, I would assume, is that we're now seeing a big shift to where sort of green electricity could become one of the dominating resources for the steel industry instead of coal. And then of course the comparative advantage of where we should produce steel will shift. I mean, there is the rural area in Germany was based on iron ore and coal, I guess, but now kind of both are gone. One is gone and one will go, hopefully, probably. So I mean, new countries and also new actors will step in, like kind of Fortescue in Australia. I know we're looking at reduced DRI directly with their iron ore. I know some people in South Africa are working to try to get them to use their solar potential. Middle East might come up. So there's a whole change in the whole ecosystem, as Ali said, but we haven't really seen where that will take us yet. And also,
I would like to maybe pick up on that, Max, because that's exactly the kind of thinking that we're also seeing, right? And that's a huge fundamental change for the steel industry if you're actually going to get a separation of the iron and the steel production, which makes a lot of sense based on the fact that, that was, of course, as you pointed out, based on the geographic location near either coal or seaport, which were necessary. Those things are going to change. So that's going to be huge. And it's a potential threat, as well for steel companies, especially, the incumbents in Europe, which run, large industrial enterprises with a lot of employees, which may, if they don't act fast enough, all of a sudden see that, potential investment that they may do in iron production in the central of Europe, which may not be so suitable for it, will not work, will not be profitable. So I guess there are a lot of strategic questions at the moment as well for steel companies. What do you do? Do you actually invest in these things? Or do you start up a joint venture somewhere new in one of those regions where it may be more beneficial to produce iron? So that's actually very, very exciting and part of that large and fast development that this sector is seeing. Another thing that I wanted to say in particular, I think that goes for India, but it goes for the whole world. And it refers a little bit to the regulatory framework that I was speaking to earlier as well, is that, yes, the costs need to come down for obviously the green manufacturing methods, but also the cost of non-green manufacturing should also go up, right? And there are CO2 prices need to come in. Europe, I think yesterday made a decision to now start in 2027, phase out the ETS by 2033. The CBAM is going to be in place. The whole world should encourage also places like India and China and the US to effectuate these kind of measures so that people that do emit high amounts of CO2 actually need to pay for it, and thereby encourage the investments that are needed to decarbonize, even if they may be more expensive, and even if the consequence is that steel will become more expensive, which is maybe right given the cost to the environment at this point. And of course, that's a tougher message to swallow for emerging markets. It may be easy for Europeans to say that. I fully realize that.
And for our listeners, just explain, if I may, for listeners, CBAM means carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and the European Parliament has just passed the relevant regulation in that area. So that'll be coming in a different kind of tax on materials traveling between borders that are high carbon. Very important development. Please, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, on the CBAM, actually, U.S. Senator Whitehouse just proposed a kind of a U.S. CBAM, so that is moving forward on this side. But the cost of steel that Eric mentioned might be rising. I mean, if we don't do anything, it won't rise necessarily because of this green transition. I mean, just look what happened in the last 1 year. The price of coal went significantly up and natural gas. So actually, locally produced renewable electricity could have more stability in terms of securing lower price than this imported natural gas from Russia or wherever, or imported coal, like China imports a lot of its coal. So that could be, this green transition could be actually be a positive thing for this energy security, not only for the country, but also for those steel companies, and secure the longer term cheaper price for their energy use. So it could be looked from that angle, and hopefully that will incentivize as well.
And that's a really good point. I mean, this is what's happening in India at the moment with gas price through the roof.
Yep. All
important for fertilizers, but also for steel. Anyone who's consuming that is now, their budgets are totally thrown. And so there's a rapid desire, or urgent desire to look for alternatives. So hopefully we can use this moment. I want to explore, as part of trying to understand the detail of the kind of investment to help us transition, this Fortescue model, Max, which is using renewable energy in Western Australia to create steel pellets, I think, then get shipped to Japan and China, which then get used in electric arc furnaces. Have I got that correct? That's an interesting model, right? Does that mean that ThyssenKrupps of the world in the Ruhr will end up having electric arc furnaces to bring in feedstocks from the likes of Western Australia or Saudi in future?
Yeah, I mean, like if you take the Ruhr area, I mean, now they import iron ore and coal, and instead they would then take away the blast furnace in that case and import direct sponge iron, or HBI, hot briquetted iron, as it's also called when it's exported. And they would have an electric arc furnace. They could also, depending on the quality, have a submerged arc furnace and a BOF. That's now we're down to technical details of the quality of the DRI, etc. But I mean, the main thing is that they could remain the hot rolling and all sort of the downstream processes of making quality steel, which then they could probably regain or keep the high added value, of course, and just shift out the very energy intensive part. But of course, I mean, we all know, I mean, I guess that Australia or Middle East or whoever has this huge potential will eventually also start to look downstream and try to get a higher share of the value, of course. Mind you, also this is also the plan of LKAB in northern Scandinavia to actually reduce the iron ore up at the mine and then export it as iron and not as iron ore instead. So I mean, it's common. It's a model that is developing actually quite rapidly, and but I think Australia will be kind of the hub of that in Southeast Asia, since they have iron ore and they have coal, and they have foremost huge potential for renewable electricity. Then it's very tough decisions for companies, for example, in Japan or in Central Europe that has maybe limited access today to renewable electricity or to other sources. How should they sort of position themselves in this transition? But I think I know they're working on it quite a lot. So I mean, again, that's a big change.
And I guess just for our listeners, shipping hydrogen long distances is a problem. You need, I think it's 3 times the volume of a tanker in terms of energy intensity compared to gas to ship hydrogen. That's a lot of very bulbous ships traveling around if we're going to ship to hydrogen. So much better if we can use it locally to create substances, commodities that have lower shipping effort and cost and hassle, including not requiring specialist ships such as those hydrogen ships. So this seems to be possible, right? But what you painted is a picture where there's a future for the Ruhr as well. And it's very important for everyone to understand that the Ruhr is not dependent on local coal and local iron ore anymore. It does import, doesn't it? So it has become a specialty manufacturing zone. And given the increasing demand, and Eric, you might have some thoughts on this, there seemed to be significantly increased demand for high quality specialty steels, notably, for example, in electric car bodies, where extra strong tensile steel is required. This would make sense to have the final finishing and adaptation close to industry where there's a need. No, so there's a really strong future for the Ruhr in that kind of model. What do you think? Is that plausible?
Well, as I said, I'm quite a strong believer of that iron versus steel making split. But we need to look at the political angle of that as well, because obviously, when there are a lot of people employed in the iron making and also the raw material preparation, right? As I said before, these are huge industrial complexes, and it takes a lot of people to run a blast furnace. So if this is going to happen, and of course here the EU may find itself a little bit in a contradiction where they say, well, we want to stimulate green investment, we want to stimulate green steel making. Maybe that's done better somewhere else, or maybe at the fringes of Europe, right? So Sweden is one of the places. I think the south of Europe may also be one of the places where this is possible. But that means a lot of job losses, for instance, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, wherever. And that's, of course, politically difficult to accept. And the unions will also not like that. So there may be some contradicting thoughts around that. And it will be very, very interesting to see how that plays out politically, and also from an investment perspective, for the companies that actually go through that. But yes, I see a lot of potential in that. And yes, if you look at what is the key, at least from my perspective, I'm just a humble banker, no metallurgist by any means, but the key skill of these steel companies that you have in Europe is that they're very, very good at steel making and really, really good at the downstream part. Now, this is, of course, informed by your iron making to a certain extent, but I think the real skill comes in the steel making, really refining it, and then creating those materials, which we also need for the energy transition, right? Ultra high strength steels that are very, very thin, that are lightweight, that make cars lighter, that require less energy to move. And cars is one example of that. So yes, there's definitely a role to play there to further innovate. And I think that's definitely the strength of the European steel industry. It's very innovative. They have developed all these high quality materials, which makes sure that they're still there. They're extremely integrated into their downstream value chains. Those value chains want to see green steel, because we should also not forget that a lot of the steel that is used goes to, cars, obviously, white goods, buildings, and a lot of the companies that buy that steel have set science-based targets for themselves to decarbonize. And in order to comply with that, they need to start buying green steel. So they're also putting pressure on the steel companies to actually do that decarbonization. And if they can do that together, as I think they've always done for a long time, to kind of develop products together and innovate together, and that can be a win-win. So there is the possibility, but I think there's also a bit of a tough choice to be had to kind of stop doing certain things, which they've been doing for a long time, and that both emotionally and politically is probably going to be tough.
And that's tied into conceptions of how we advance our economies, isn't it? I mean, we've seen the transition from, I'm going to call it raw manufacturing, to high value added manufacturing in lots of different sectors. And I think there's a report by a paper by the IMF a couple of weeks ago I read, which talked about the extent to which intangibles in a balance sheet are now the major predictor of wealth creation and so on. So the equivalent of intangibles in a balance sheet here would be the design application of steel as distinct from the creation of the raw product. And I'm obviously saying this specifically to our European decision makers, that the future of steel, like the future of pretty well any industry, is going to be in the high value creation from raw materials to specialist applications, especially the design application and the marketing of it. And we need to be thinking about job creation, industrial creation that way, I suspect, rather than locking us into old things. But we still have a tendency, don't we, Max, to lock ourselves into old solutions. This is what we know how to do. We don't want to. In the steel industry, Eric was very chirpy early on about the interest from steel companies, the discussion recently. But how much of the barrier that we face is to do with legacy or lethargy or inability or unwillingness of some industries and some things to move? Or do you think that's going?
I think, you're absolutely right that yes, there is a legacy, but in human capacity and people's attitudes, but that can change. People are people and they tend to change, but they need a push. There's also this kind of hard facts legacy in terms of infrastructure, sunk assets, sunk values, whatever, as we call of carbon lock-in. We know what we have. If we're going to do something else, we need to re-educate. We need to do a lot of different things. So, yes, but as we said, again, the 10 coming years will be crucial. It's now time to start making that transition for all these steel companies and trying to develop the new skills. And a lot of them need new skills. They need, again, to sort of attract younger skilled people at a higher added value than they have been so far. And I totally agree with you also that, the high added value could remain in Europe if we're in Europe, and then we're reasoning like an economist. We're not reasoning like maybe a politician today that would say, well, jobs are, the high value, that's nice, but jobs are more important. And we also have to recognize that steel production is also part of the core industrial state in terms of job creation and and that is, I would argue, one of the main reasons why India they want to produce their own steel to the largest extent possible. They might be different, and China has done so why shouldn't other countries do so? So this transition we're seeing, splitting iron to other parts of the world, that might happen, but it will not be fully happen. We'll still have full production in all parts of the world, and mostly in all parts of the country. But there will definitely be something that changes some parts of the steel industry.
Fabiana, you got your hand up, please.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm getting excited about the opportunities here. Go ahead.
Just we reached the hour, and I was wondering if it's a good time to answer some questions from the from the audience. I already answered a couple in the writing version, but there is a couple of questions for the panelists, and yeah, and also one that is maybe relevant for Anna about SLBs. So
fire away, give us one.
So Anna, are you still there? Also, you can answer this, Sean. But many sustainability-linked finance instruments are currently used for corporate financing. Does the STIL criteria aims to include an obligation to disclose the list of projects and amounts spent matching the proceeds of the certified climate bond? So I think this is relevant for these discussions we have about SLBs in comparison to what we're used to use of proceed bonds. So who wants to take that one? Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to take that one. Thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting one. It touched briefly on this on the slides, but essentially when we're going to be looking to certify something that has got company level KPIs attached, whether that's in an SLB or whether it's a company certification itself, what we will be looking for is a number of different things. We'll be looking for what your transition pathway is forecast to be, what your KPIs and internal targets are, and how well they align to the criteria that have been laid out today and will be in our STIL criteria. So basically, how ambitious are you being with setting your targets, and do they align with our criteria? Are they on a 1.5 degree pathway, or will they reach that fairly soon and then stay on that? But as well as the targets, the second part of it is the credibility of delivery against those targets. And so we touched on the idea about needing to have a transition plan. And within that, that will talk about your CapEx plans. So we'll be looking to see evidence of your CapEx plans, looking to see your strategies, how you're going to deliver it, which therefore might include the projects you're going to invest in, the CapEx you're going to invest in, the capital investments you're going to undertake, essentially, and maybe even your divestment strategies, or what you're going to do about relining, and all those kind of things are what we want to know about, and would also be part of the evaluation for certification, plus usual things about the extent to which you're internally and externally reporting as usual, and also some governance factors as well, which we don't have in the use of proceeds bonds, because this is about credibility of delivering against future promises and targets. And so we do want to get into a little bit of the governance side more than we do with the use of proceeds bonds. So there'll be a lot of other elements alongside, do your targets and your performance, do your performance today meet the criteria, and do your future targets meet the criteria going forward? So there'll actually be a lot about the ability to deliver, which is a more subjective area. We're currently working on the rule set for those aspects around credibility and ability to deliver, and criteria around the transition plan and the governance, etc. And that will be coming up for consultation in a month or so's time. Those rules are going to be fairly generic, so they won't necessarily be specific to STIL. They'll apply to all companies. What do we want to see in the transition plan more broadly, or what sort of governance measures should be taken more broadly, regardless of what sector you're in. So all of that will be kind of, so to answer the question about that, it's not specifically about listing the projects to the value of the bond with an SLB, but it's about really digging into the detail of how you're going to deliver on those targets, and that will be part of the assessment for certification. So yeah, watch this space for the upcoming consultation on those rules and procedures around those new aspects we haven't got in the certification criteria at the moment.
And I think it's important to note there are a couple of different ways this will work. There's the specific investments, there's the corporate strategy, and they can be quite different. A corporate strategy, as Anna's talking about, that addresses the primary headline is a critical path forward. But companies that may be high carbon now and may make specific investments using the use of proceeds model, which will qualify. Ali, can you give us just bring you back in? Give us a couple of examples of the likely use of proceeds investments that we talked about here that people are going to make. Just practically speaking, what's on the horizon? I mean, I'm assuming electric arc furnaces, right?
Yeah, if it's like for a new facility, for example, could be an electric arc furnace, or could be, as we have listed in the slide, for example, a hydrogen DRI facility. So that for new facility. And then for existing facilities that we set the criteria given if they're younger than 15 years old, for example, blast furnace, the type of improvement that can qualify as the bundle should result to 15 to 20% reduction in CO2 intensity. That could be a bundle of For example, series of waste heat recovery, whether it's, I don't know, cook dry quenching, top pressure recovery turbine, some waste heat recovery in addition to some fuel switching, whether it's using hydrogen in the fuel mix or some electrification in parts of the process, and bundle of those could result into that 15-20% that we're expecting. So there are many measures. I mean, this is just an example that could be applied to existing facility to give that 15 to 20% as a bundle, or for the new facilities, those few that we have listed could qualify.
So that's a really important message. There are many measures that would qualify, while the transition and to 2030 and beyond is still nevertheless ambitious. Until 2030, there's many retrofit kind of measures that apply that are spelt out in there. For our listeners, that's important to understand, because we just can't afford to leave plants that are going to keep operating for a long period, just operating at the same carbon levels they are now. We have to bring those down as well as part of this transition. Another question, Fabiana, you think we should tackle?
Well, there is a lot of questions specific about the criteria. I invite you to also add your feedback in our public consultation form, which is going to be, it's already uploaded in our website. There is questions like, what is the reasoning for no criteria on scrap and or hydrogen DRI inputs in the EAFs for existing facilities?
Let's tackle that
one. Yeah, the short answer is that we had a lot of discussions about this, but basically, and Ali can complement my answer, basically the best options for the available or the existing EAFs to lower their emissions, since they already have low emissions, is to use renewable energies and to use or low carbon energies. So this is what we are incentivizing for existing facilities. Yeah, however, I also invite you to include your feedback in our form. And Ali, I don't know if you have something to add for this.
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Max, can I ask you a question, which I thought was quite useful? If we're going to get this right, what needs to happen immediately, like in the next 24 months?
Thank you. That's a good question, and I hopefully have an easy answer. I would say for companies, it's a matter of actually making a commitment and making a plan, and it has to be on a strategic level. That's maybe no sort of easy task to ask of a company, but still, if you don't know where you're going, you might as well end up there. That's a Yogi Berra quote, but I mean, basically, you need to have a plan, you need to have a direction for the company if you're going, and if you have that, a lot of things will follow. You would start to see opportunities that you haven't seen before. Your customers would start to ask you and put signals to you to go move faster, and they would accept that maybe you have to have this price increase or whatever. I mean, it is also the politicians will see that companies are moving and will then be eager somehow to help. So I mean, make a plan and make a commitment. Start in that. If you haven't done that, that's what the short term should be. Make that. Then you can work in the longer term to actually fulfilling it, because there's a lot of challenges in this. Yes, of course, but I mean, have a vision and have a plan. That's the key.
And make sure that vision and plan is commensurate with the ambition, for example, we've outlined here, or the IEA's outlined, and so on. But some of this is hard, Ali, isn't it? Like, for example, we've suggested in our modelling that there'll be a massive increase in recycling of steel, but we have difficulties in recycling as much steel as produced. And I say this because my friends working on circular economy things are constantly telling me we need to recycle everything in the sector, which sounds like we ought to. But what are the kind of constraints? What are the kinds of difficulties? Why can't we recycle everything? Why couldn't we increase it even more than what we're already proposing? Can you give us a bit of a sense?
For the case of a steel, I mean, we are talking about a steel here, so recycling of other materials has its own challenges. But in the case of a steel, the recycling rate in some countries are actually pretty good. In some other countries, yeah, they need to work on better recycling system, which is nothing really that complicated. I mean, many countries are doing it, so it's something that they can, learn. It's not something really new we are talking about. It's not like technological to gather that scrap that's available. The main issue is it's just not enough scrap available, first of all, to go around. And the second is, for certain types of steel, we do need to put, primary material, meaning iron ore-based steel. And that is also a constraint for certain types of steel. But it's just overall, even if we recycle a little more scrap, still we are not going to have enough scrap to significantly increase. In the future, however, we are doing actually analysis for China net zero steel industry. There's going to be significant amount of steel available in China and other places as these economies, mature, and some of the construction that they had before, the scrap is going to be available. And then things are going to change. That's why we are going to have much higher share of electric arc furnace moving forward. But still, the primary steel making is going to be there even up to 2050. At least about half of the steel will be there.
So what's a high level of recycling that we can expect? Best practice, let's say, Ali or Max, on this, just so lay people can understand. Recycling levels for steel. Are we talking about 50% or 75% of steel being recycled, or 99.4%?
I mean, 85% is normally quoted as a quite good level.
Okay.
You will never reach 99, but I mean, at least 85, and you can probably increase it there. I think the questions more on recycling is actually, all steel is not equal, and recycled steel, scrap is not all equal. It's more of a question of actually recycling have the right quality, and to know the quality in the steel that you're recycling, so that you can use it to the sort of purpose that is fit for that type of quality steel. There's a lot of development going on in that. But I would say 85 to 90%. Would you agree, Ali?
Yeah, that's really, I would say, high. But the fact that even if you have high recycling rate, it's still, like, if many countries have that high recycling rate, still we will not have enough scrap to significantly today increase our EAF steel production. But that's not to say that we should not improve our recycling rate. Definitely.
Yeah, I tried to explain that in my very quick presentation, but there is like some main factors. That is how much will become available because stuff get old. Quality that is needed, or the technologies to make the proper quality steel with that scrap that is low quality, and basically the availability that will be a top. Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting question in the chat, if I may, that I would like to quickly speak to. It's on the data disclosure and standards, which I think is a very, very important and very, very good point. And I think Fabiana, you also mentioned this, and I think this is also important for this initiative. The work that we've been doing with a number of banks on the sustainable steel principles, where obviously as banks we are being requested to give disclosure on the carbon intensity of our steel investment portfolios. The first problem that we ran into is that it's actually very, very difficult to compare reported emissions from steel companies with each other. It's very, very difficult to get an apple-to-apple comparison. It's for that reason that next to a methodology for banks to report on their carbon intensity of their lending portfolios, we also worked on a methodology for steel companies, how to report consistently. And this is not something that we as bankers came up with, and we borrowed heavily from the Net Zero Steel Pathway Methodology Project that I think also informs responsible steel. And this is something that's very, very important. And recently I was in Copenhagen at the Steel Zero conference, where I've heard similar sounds actually also coming from off-takers. So the question came from the perspective of the governments. But I think that it's up to the largest stakeholders in the steel industry, right? So finance, off-takers, to actually say what they want. and set those kind of standards and make sure that also those standards are all aligned with each other, so we don't get a fragmented field where steel companies have to report different things to their bank, to their government, and to their off-taker, because that wouldn't make sense. And I think it would be appropriate, if off-takers and banks, for instance, can get together with something that's industry supported, that governments would then subsequently also basically take that over instead of, again, coming up with something new, because typically they're not very good at that. So I think that's a very important part to think about, and that's definitely something that within our group we'll be thinking long and hard about also in the coming months as we roll out our standard, how we can further align that with other things that are out there that are being brought forward by other important stakeholders. But it's a big part of the puzzle, because it's difficult to have the conversation about decarbonizing if you don't have the common baseline.
Very good point. And we will need to pick that up in our policy work that we're also doing, and we'll be coming back to you on details around that in the future. Fabio, if you're there, we'll talk about that one. There's a couple other questions, but I'm conscious we're running out of time. Before we go to final comments, folks, in a few minutes, Fabiana, in terms of the criteria, and Ali as well, in terms of the criteria, we've got to the end of the session. We've had, for me at least, a very interesting conversation about steel. But what do people need to take away from this? Give me the 2 key points that people need to remember that we haven't actually covered so far. Just give me a bit of a granular detail. Fabiana first, then Ali.
Yeah, I will say that for existing facilities, we really looked into how to help those blast furnaces that still need a lot of time to go to relining, to lower their levels of emissions to what the pathway tells us. So to be already decarbonizing to 2030 levels, and for new facilities to already be low carbon, because it's possible. So there is a lot of things with this in this sector that are possible to do already now. Mm-hmm. Ali, I don't know if you want to add.
So there's a lot of things that could do now. That's not bad, Ali, as a starting point. Over to you.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. So we took IEA net zero pathway as a guideline, and what we recommended actually is in line with that, but also fortunately is quite doable, like 15 to 20% reduction with a bundle of measure, while maybe a little is absolutely doable. Actually, we have like case studies, Fabiana can share probably, like companies applying for green bonds that they're bundling measures and claiming by 2030 they're going to save 25%. So it's absolutely doable for those existing plans, bundle of measure. And then for these new facilities, the technologies that we have listed, whether it's hydrogen, DRI, and CCS, some of those are new technologies. Some of them are being built now. For example, hydrogen, DRI, hopefully there will be success stories. And after that, more people feel more comfortable allocating capital and installing those. So I would say quite achievable, quite possible with the technologies that are available.
And a question for you, Max. What do we need governments to do? What are the couple of takeaways for our public sector at this point?
Well, I think governments work on 2 different fronts here. One is actually helping and create the demand for green steel, and that is shifting. That looks different in different countries. I mean, I was in a conference yesterday and talking to an automaker that had decided to buy only green steel, and they said they don't think of green premiums anymore. They said that's a strategic option for them now. It's just a social license to operate. Sort of, that's just it. It's nothing. No. In other countries, you would still have to motivate any kind of cost increases, and that is sort of understandable. But the government can always help to actually to fix that market through public procurement and everything else. The second part is to look at the resources available, needed, and to help with infrastructure. That is very key. And also to help to sort of unleash the potential of renewable electricity or gas infrastructure if CCS is preferred. Sort of, but that is just, there is a huge potential in renewable electricity that needs to be unleashed. And that is happening in a lot of countries, but in some countries it's still lacking. Then, of course, I mean, the main point, I guess, is also each new investment or reinvestment in any high emitting or fossil technology needs today to be seriously questioned if we're going to meet 1.5 degree target. There is extremely little room left to make those kind of investments. And I would say definitely not in Europe. We should go before, and also the US, for the lead rest world. In this sense, we have the greatest historical responsibility. But I mean, also in developing countries, they cannot be really far behind either, unfortunately. We're in that position right now. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about the steel, about car manufacturers? So when the car manufacturer's been talking about is saying they're going to have a green steel procurement requirement, which is fantastic from a climate perspective. What's the extra marginal cost of the car that comes from shifting to at the moment? I mean, hopefully it won't be in the long run.
No, but I mean, we did those kind of calculations, just rough, because it's always difficult to know exactly. But we said, I mean, the steel will get maybe 30%, 35% more expensive, something like that. But if you make it out on a car, that means that the car would get less than 1% more expensive. And you can easily sell that to a customer if you're selling a quite expensive car. And as he said, I mean, they're making electric cars. So I said, I mean, that was the first one. He said electric, then it's green. No, that's not enough anymore. The steel has to be green. The battery has to be procured green. Everything has to be green and sustainable. And that's sort of the way where they're moving right now. And that's sort of the social license to operate. So the costs are not that big for the end consumer. And I think the end consumers are willing to pay that. At least here in Europe and the US, and also, I mean, a lot of the climate policy is expanding for the CBAMs or the carbon adjustments and so on. So a lot of the imports we make from other countries will also have to will feel the influence of actually having to meet European or US market demands in that sense. So I think it's a growing market, and also Japan and Korea, of course.
So that pricing differential people need to understand. At a wholesale level, it may be, for the moment, until we ramp up production of green steel. Remember that as we ramp up, costs drop like a stone, particularly if things like hydrogen costs do meet the kind of statements that we've been hearing about. But even then, it's still only 1% extra cost of the car. I mean, you can sell more cars out of that if you pitched it as a green car in lots of places. So this makes this incredibly achievable, doesn't it? Look, we need to wrap up. Eric, from you, I want a sense of how does this look from your pipeline? Are you going to be the most successful banker in ING because this deal flow is going to be vast? Well, sorry, I know there's lots of vibrations there, but how exciting is this for you? I mean, you devoted a lot of your time and energy to try to make this happen. Where are you in the journey?
It's super exciting. I mean, steel used to be something that, well, with all due respect, was a little bit boring and conservative, difficult industry. That has completely changed now, and there's so much innovation going on there, and there's so many opportunities for companies to gain competitive advantages, to build businesses that are sustainable through the cycle, all the kind of things that we look for as a bank. So yeah, that's very, very exciting. The difficulty, I think, today is that it's still very difficult to create the appropriate business cases, right? And I think to repeat a couple of the things that Max said, we need to have the appropriate regulatory environment. So a lot of renewable energy we need, and that needs to be provided by the regulators, for instance, by shortening permitting times, right? That's a big issue. So that's one of the things we need. Off-takers need to take responsibility by, for instance, being willing to commit to longer-term off-take contracts, by paying green premia, which actually can enable the business cases to be made so that bankers like ourselves can invest in them. Because even though, of course, we want to invest in sustainability, also, we need to be careful to our stakeholder base. We can't invest in opportunities that are not sustainable from a financial perspective, right? So this is what needs to happen. It's slowly happening, but not at the pace that I would like it to see, but I'm sure that will happen within the next 5 years. So yeah, then there'll definitely be a lot to do for me.
Excellent news. Fabiana, a last word? Are you positive?
Yes, I'm very positive. We're very happy to publish this criteria for consultation. And I posted again the website. It's in the comments. So everybody just send us our feedback. It's very important for us. Mm-hmm.
Ali, a last thought word?
No, thank you so much. This was a very interesting discussion and looking forward to receiving feedback from all folks and yeah, hopefully get this criteria out soon.
And Max, give us a parting comment.
The next 10 years will be very exciting to see if we actually manage this. And I think I have good hopes that we will do so.
Folks, you've heard from the experts today. A revolution is upon us in the steel industry of all places. Who would have thought? And it's fantastic, necessary, important, critical that we make this work for us and we make it work fast because of the challenges we face, the extraordinary challenges we face with this freight train of climate change coming down the railway at us. We have to change things fast. Max has said, this year, next year, corporate policies have to come up to scratch. We've outlined in these strategy, this particular set of criteria, individual steps companies can make, and also the way of assessing a corporate strategy. So as companies come up with this corporate strategy this year and next year, we will be providing certification for that forward planning so that people can actually get access to the green market, green finance, because not only is there preferential demand in green cars, there's also preferential demand amongst investors for green investment opportunities, as Eric was telling earlier. It's an extraordinary opportunity, vast in terms of the change we have to make in a short time. It is eminently doable, as you have heard so eloquently by our friends today. We can do this, but we've got no time to rest. We need to be running, not walking. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And I'm going to say thank you for the work you will be doing to change this industry and change this world. Good luck. You need it. We need it. This is all available on YouTube recording, and the consultation is available on the Clump-On's website. Please do have a look. Please do comment.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.